Have you heard of the Great Game? How does the chessboard for geopolitical rivalry look like in the 21st century? Let's dive into it. The geopolitical competition between great powers is being fought on three primary theaters: Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia. Let's have a closer look at these three theaters. In Europe, Russia is challenging the US hegemony. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has brought war back to Europe, sending shockwaves around the globe. Russia is supported by China, Iran, and North Korea, while Australia, Japan, and South Korea are providing aid to Ukraine. Even if the war in Ukraine is settled or frozen, potential new conflicts in the Balkans, the Baltics, and the Caucasus could further escalate tensions between the West and Russia. As a result, Europe is likely to remain a primary conflict zone in the geopolitical competition in the medium term. In the Middle East, Iran is openly challenging US hegemony. At the same time, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates are competing for influence. With ongoing conflicts and wars in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen, the region is already in turmoil. An Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear facilities could escalate the ongoing conflict between these two regional powers into a full-scale regional war with global implications. Iranian retaliation, potentially targeting oil facilities in the Gulf, could trigger a massive energy crisis with global repercussions. China's mediation of an agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, as well as the inclusion of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Ethiopia into the BRICS, highlight Beijing's growing influence in the region. Meanwhile, India is also strengthening partnerships with Iran, Israel, and the Gulf states. With so many actors potentially involved in the region, the Middle East is likely to remain a primary conflict zone in the geopolitical competition. Unlike in Europe and the Middle East, where the US and China advocate for nuclear restraint, in East Asia, the core interests of both superpowers are so deeply at stake that the nuclear escalation cannot be ruled out. Adding to the volatility, North Korea regularly engages in nuclear saber rattling. Given these high stakes, both major powers are striving to prevent an escalation into a full-scale war. If East Asia becomes the main theater of a new Cold War, the region could experience a level of stability similar to that of Europe during the last Cold War, while other regions might become vulnerable to proxy wars. However, a hot conflict over Taiwan would be difficult to contain and could quickly escalate into a regional or even global war. Now that we understand the layout of the chessboard, how are major powers playing it? We can already observe how major powers are attempting to tactically exploit the competing priorities across these three primary theaters. Russia is trying to divert Western attention and resources away from Ukraine and into the Middle East and East Asia. Its engagement in Syria, in the Sahel zone, and even more so its security cooperation with North Korea are driven by this logic. However, recent setbacks in Mali and Syria suggest that Moscow may have overplayed its hand. In fact, the entanglements of Russia and Iran in their respective wars has created an opportunity that Turkish-backed militias have used to challenge the Assad regime. How Russia will maintain its influence in the Middle East remains to be seen. Moscow's latest agreement with Sudan and the talks with Syria's new rulers may give you a hint. The United States remains an indispensable offshore balancer in each primary theater. This underscores that, despite frequent claims of relative decline, the US continues to hold a top position in the global power structure. However, the Trump administration will need to carefully avoid overstretching American resources, a vulnerability that adversaries could exploit to weaken US influence. Given limited resources and the unwillingness or inability of key allies to take on a greater role in upholding US hegemony, Donald Trump may feel increasingly tempted to strike deals that come at the expense of Americans' partners. The blunt directives given by the American Vice President and US Secretary of Defense underline that the Trump administration will use all of its leverage to shift the burden of European defense onto European shoulders. The US is committed to focus its resources on the hegemonic conflict with China. Should Europe fail to deliver, the transatlantic alliance, the main pillar of European security for 80 years, is over. Throughout the Indo-Pacific, US allies must grapple with the strategic consequences of American involvement in two active wars in Europe and the Middle East. Even a superpower's resources are not unlimited, making it difficult to fully realize the long-promised pivot to Asia or sustain even a third major war in East Asia. The fear of a potential US withdrawal in Tokyo, Seoul, and Canberra mirrors similar concerns in Berlin, Tel Aviv, or Riyadh. But it's not just a strategic consideration of the Trump administration. The real bind is the zero-sum logic of the geopolitics in a three-theater world. For instance, just as Russia's quagmire in Ukraine has direct implications for its setback in Syria, a full-scale war between Israel and Iran would have serious and immediate consequences for US support of Ukraine. Europeans must recognize that the competing priorities across the conflict zones in Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia shape their strategic environment just as much as the developments on the battlefield in Ukraine itself. The same logic dictates that US strategic focus on competition with China will create significant shift of responsibilities for European security onto Europe's shoulders, no matter who sits in the White House. Europe needs to learn how this new chessboard is played. Since Western European citizens are unwilling to accept welfare cuts to finance military buildup, Europe is unlikely to have the resources to project military power beyond its immediate neighborhood. As a result, Europeans need to forego security engagements in faraway theaters like East Asia, where its core interests are not at stake, and concentrate on the defense of its own continent and the stabilization of its neighborhood.